So without further ado, we're playing 15 plus 10. We're playing longer games. We are putting an accent on the openings. And let's hope for a somewhat more competitive game. Here we go. Okay, we're playing 1,000. And I remind you that my sort of official recommendation in this speedrun is the Accelerated Dragon, which is actually the opening that I started with. Our very first speedrun, I was almost exclusively playing the Accelerated. We had great results, and it's an incredibly easy to learn weapon that I recommend to a wide variety of players. C4. So C4 is already a pretty big surprise. It's a move. So I've seen this move before, and it's not a terrible move. You can almost think of this as a transposition to an English, right? White can also play C4. You can respond to C5, and then white can play E4 and move 2. Now, the obvious drawback of this move, and this is really the first thing that should jump out at you, is of course the fact that white has created this massive hole on D4. And a hole is, the definition of a hole or a weakness is a square that cannot hypothetically even be defended by any pawns. And often that's because the pawns which could defend the square are now one step further. In this case, the E and the C pawns have advanced to the 4th rank. They cannot themselves defend a square on the 4th rank. So of course this gives the knight potentially a massive outpost on D4. But what a lot of people don't understand is that just because the hole exists doesn't mean that you want to occupy it ASAP. We should start with the move knight c6, but not because we're going to play knight d4 on the next move. It's way too early to occupy the outpost because we don't have any other pieces developed. And if we put a knight on d4 straight away, then white's just going to go knight f3 and knock our knight off of d4. It's more the long-term weakness that's going to cost white later on down the line when all of the development is complete. But the other thing that we get is we get a potentially massive diagonal for our dark-squared bishop. Knight f3. So here, there's kind of a really interesting moment. The move that we are going to play is g6. But if I were playing a classical game, a real over-the-board game, and somebody played this against me, I actually would play a somewhat different move. I would play the move e6 or knight f6. And after the game, I'll talk a little bit about why. But the basics of why should be clear to you. What does the move g6 allow white to do should white want to transition to main lines? What is the drawback of the move g6 here? Yeah, of course it allows white to push the pawn to d4. And after d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, we transpose, and we're going to play g6, directly to the Naroditsky bind variation of the Accelerated Dragon. But since we're putting the emphasis on openings, I actually wouldn't mind that. But from a purely objective standpoint, the way to quote-unquote punish white for playing c4 is, of course, not to allow a transposition to main lines. It's to put pressure on the e4 pawn, try to prevent white from playing d4 in a good version. But hopefully my logic makes sense. And our opponent has played d3. And that solidifies the hole on d4. And after bishop g7, we're flat out better out of the opening. We've got great pieces, and we're dominating the dark squares in the center. And of course, not to mention the fact that white's bishop, light-squared bishop, is now essentially a big pawn. So hopefully we'll get some Marotzis a little bit later. Knight c3. And now we can continue our development in rather normal fashion. So in general, in such positions, it's a self-evidently good idea to trade our light-squared bishop for white's knight on f3. So imagine if these pieces are gone from the board. That's a good thing to kind of do, right? To visualize certain minor pieces disappearing from the board. What effect will that have on the position? Well, if the knight on f3 disappears, then clearly our control over the d4 square only increases. And at that point, we can seriously start contemplating already putting a knight on d4, which will be not quite unassailable, actually quite far away from unassailable, because white can still use the dark-squared bishop or even the c3 knight to trade the knight off. But both of those moves are associated with a lot of awkwardness. And the best way to threaten to trade the f3 knight is, of course, to play the move d6, which, again, also just improves our position and is a normal developing move. But I like the move d6 a little bit more than knight f6. I actually think that we probably should delay the move knight f6 until a more opportune moment has occurred. And as you'll see, we actually can develop the knight to e7, which is very common in the Sicilian. Okay, now we proceed with our positional plan. We develop our bishop to g4. We continue clamping down on the d4 square. We trade a piece that controls that square. And this is like sort of very classic positional chess 101. Bishop e2. Now, what a lot of people struggle with in a situation like this is like, okay, do we actually proactively take on f3, or is there no hurry? So it doesn't matter, right? You can take on f3, or you can continue your kingside development, and both options are good. We're going to try to emphasize like classic rudimentary positional play. So I'm actually going to eliminate this knight while we still have a chance. The drawback of not doing that is that the knight actually could have moved away. And the trade of light squared bishops is okay for black, but it's not quite as glamorous as getting rid of white's knight. And again, I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. There is no hurry to put the knight on d4. Right? We can do it here. We can play knight d4. And you can say, well, after the trade, bishop takes d4, we now have uncontested control of all of the dark squares, right? Our dark squared bishop is now operating uncontested. That's a good thing. Knight d4 is a solid move, but we're going to practice restraint. And what we're going to do instead is find a developing square for the g8 knight such that it doesn't obstruct our own control of the d4 square, which would be the weakness of the move knight to f6. So if we play knight f6 here, later on, we might then have to drop the knight back down to d7, for example, to increase our control over d4. But instead, if you've played the Sicilian a good amount, you should know that there is what was introduced to me as the Botvinnik setup. And I think this has several different names. The Botvinnik setup is how I was taught. This is the name that I was taught. And the Botvinnik setup simply entails fianchettoing your dark squared bishop, then carving out a alternate developing square for the g8 knight with the move e6, specifically with the move e6 or e5. Yeah, the Botvinnik stuff is also e5. So we play e6, and then we get this knight out to e7. And the reason we do all of this, again, is to make sure that our dark squared bishop is still is unobstructed, right? We don't want our knight blocking our bishop. Also, the pawn on e6 is kind of an asset. It's controlling some important squares. It's controlling d5. It's controlling f5. We're creating kind of a toothy construction in the center where our pawns are kind of like teeth, you know, controlling all of these important squares. Yeah, e5 I don't like. I mean, e5 would be a very bad move here. e5 would be a very bad move because it would just return the favor, right? We don't want to create a weakness of our own on d5. Also, we don't necessarily want to block in the bishop like that. Okay, so now knight g7. Notice how harmoniously our pieces are placed. Every piece is sort of clearly occupying a well-defined role. And our general strategy is to continue clamping down on these center squares. We're making it very, very hard for white to basically move. In earlier speedruns, I mentioned that in the Sicilian, you want to avoid playing e6 and g6 in the same breath. This is a totally different scenario because the center is closed. The caveat to that rule is that when the center is open, you often don't want to combine the moves e6 and g6 because it creates dark squared holes. Here, these holes are totally inaccessible because white's got a bunch of pawns in the center. So, okay, like white can play a move like knight b5 here. Big whoop. It's a total paper tiger. It doesn't even threaten anything. We can just chase it away with a6. That's also why when we play the move e6, we shouldn't worry about quote-unquote weakening the d6 pawn because the d6 pawn is well protected by the queen and it's essentially unattackable. Bishop g5 by our opponent. Okay, so I'm most definitely not afraid of white taking on e7. That actually is what we want. We want white to give away his dark squared bishop, especially for the e7 knight, which relatively speaking is the inferior, the most inferior of our pieces, leaving the other knight to jump into d4. So what I like here is to sort of lure white, you know, to prod white into taking on e7 with the move h6. The reason I don't like the move castles kingside quite as much is because of the move queen to d2 in response. And at that point, white is already threatening to trade the dark squared bishops. And I use the word threatening deliberately, right? It is a serious positional threat. We most certainly do not want to get rid of our dark squared bishop. That is the pride of our position. So by playing h6, we are doing two things. We are, of course, provoking our opponent into taking on e7. But if white drops back to h4, which is very likely, doesn't happen, then we would be able to castle kingside without fearing that white's going to build up the battery and trade bishops with bishop h6. Hopefully that makes sense. So obviously we take with the queen in order to leave the knight, give the knight continued access to the d4 square. And we are not worried about the king and the queen being aligned, once again, because the center is closed. Queen a4. Okay, the knight is pinned. Our next move is obvious. We need to complete our development by castling kingside. And finally, we have exited the opening and entered the middle game. Black is much better. I wouldn't say that we're winning. Probably, if I had to throw out an evaluation, I would say it's maybe minus 1.5, -2, something like that. So it's a very serious advantage. And again, just notice the control that we are exerting over the dark squares. White cannot move. White is just totally stuck. White is a bad bishop. And now we're going to start the process of converting these sort of abstract positional advantages into something more concrete. I think this is what a lot of people get anxious about. They're like, well, yeah, I get it. Hypothetically, I get that we're much better, but how do we actually make something of these positional advantages? And this is, I think, hopefully going to be the instructive part of this game. So, of course, there is the move knight d4, which we can play now. We can play it a little bit later. Let's set that aside. Knight d4 is not a plan. Knight d4 is a move. And if we play knight d4 here, white's going to drop the bishop back to d1. White's probably not going to allow us to take on f3 and ruin the pawn structure on the king side. So if you've played the Sicilian for a good amount of time, there is a stock plan in such positions that I think is perfectly applicable here. And this plan will probably involve the move knight d4 at some point. Essentially, the plan consists in developing a queenside pawn storm, but also to open up files on the queen side. And when your pieces are placed in superior fashion compared to your opponent's pieces, usually opening up the center, opening up flanks is going to benefit the side with better placed pieces. What plan am I talking about? What is this mysterious plan that opens up files on the queen side? Well, it's to prepare a very particular kind of pawn break. And this pawn break involves the move b7, b5. That is the pawn break itself. And to prepare it, we should start with the move a6. Very unassuming looking move, a6. And if you look at this situation tactically, you actually might notice that b5 is given, if things remain as they stand now, b5 is possible on the next move. We don't actually even have to prepare it any further. So if you do some calculation after b5, if white plays c takes b5, a takes b5, queen takes b5, then the knight can jump into d4. And not only will we be able to take the bishop and ruin the kingside pawn structure, but if we want to be materialistic, we can jump into c2. Notice that the moment a rook appeared on u1, I'm already thinking about landing a knight on c2, especially because of how accessible that square is through d4. Okay, so I'm combining tactical observations and knowledge of typical plans in this type of position. And this a6 b5 plan is virtually universal in almost all anti-Sicilians. And when I say anti-Sicilians, I mean non-open Sicilians. Open Sicilian being white playing the move knight f3 and then d4. That's open Sicilian. Anything else is considered basically anti-Sicilians. So let's fast forward again to the current position. We've just played a6. Again, notice that I am not rushing the move knight d4. I'm keeping this for the most opportune moment. h3. So our opponent has not actually taken any action against b5. So what's interesting is that we don't have to play b5 immediately. I actually like the thought of going knight d4 first. So if you look at the situation carefully, after knight d4, the bishop really only has one square, right? d1. Because if knight d4, bishop g4, we can chase the bishop with h5. So after knight d4, bishop d1, b5, the white queen is virtually trapped, if you look at that position carefully. Because it can't go back to d1. There's now a bishop there. c2 and b3 are protected by the black knight. And if the queen drops back to a3, then we push the pawn to b4. That's another fork against the queen and the knight. You could actually make a serious case that b5 in this position is a little bit inaccurate because it allows the queen to drop all the way back to d1. And in that situation, you might say, oh, but then we play b4 and we win the b2 pawn. But you don't quite do that because b4 white has the move knight a4 and white is still hanging on. And after b5, queen d1, knight d4, you're no longer threatening to ruin white's structure with knight takes f3 check. So the effect of the move has been slightly diminished. So hopefully I've been able to explain my logic. Now, after knight d4, a very advanced player would actually still play the move queen to d1. I think this is white's only move that doesn't lose almost on the spot. But that is not an easy move to play because that involves sort of understanding why it's a bad idea to move the bishop back, which to me seems a lot more natural. If our opponent plays queen d1, then we can respond with b5. But it's totally worth starting with this move. It's more flexible, and to test white's reaction. And that's not called playing for tricks, right? That's called being practical. If there's no cost to you, then it's absolutely worth playing the move order that entails more tricks or that gives your opponent more rope. But this is a pretty minor subtlety. Both of these moves would have been totally fine. So you shouldn't think so categorically about, oh, if I play b5, that means I made a big mistake. No, both of these moves are totally fine. We're talking about relatively minor subtleties here. But even if you're basically a beginner, hopefully you were able to follow that logic. And I'll show this once again after the game over the board for those who had a little bit of a hard time visualizing, which is also totally fine. Yeah, rook e3 is possible, of course. Rook e3 is possible, of course. But then, first of all, we can still play b5. And after rook e3, the sexy move that we have is actually h5, with the idea of putting a bishop on h6 and chasing the rook away once again. Bishop d1 is played, and boom goes the dynamite. We strike at the other side with b5. And white is borderline. I think at this point already white is lost. Okay, and now white is definitely lost because the queen is literally trapped. The queen is literally trapped. And that's how quickly, like at this level, when you know typical plans, they tend to work like a charm. I mean, this was pretty extreme, but it's not a coincidence that this type of plan resulted in success. Like if you diligently learn and read about the typical middle game plans and the openings that you play, and hopefully this speedrun is going to actually help you if you want to follow my opening recommendations, you want to build a repertoire from scratch, hopefully I will succeed in showing you these types of typical plans that you can apply in your own games. It's over. White has to give the queen away well, the most that white can give it away for is the rook. Queen takes a8 is technically the best move, but in addition to the extra queen, we have managed to keep all of the advantages of the position to begin with, so it's completely lost. Now, of course, queen a5 here would be the only move to keep the game going. But even after queen a5, I think we could virtually trap the queen by playing, we'll talk about this after the game, but I'm pretty sure b4, and then maybe dropping the knight back to c6 comes very close. We'll check. Queen a5, we can, okay, queen takes a8 played, rook takes a8, and, okay, a3. Well, that's fine with us. We can simply continue our plan. What was our plan? Well, our plan was to expand on the queen side to open up files, and the move here should occur to you very naturally. Yeah, of course, b4 is like literally begging to be played, especially because the white rooks are disconnected, which means a takes b4 is impossible. Knight e2 is good. Okay, so now again, we have like a gazillion ways to win this. I remind you that in such cases, there's two overarching plans. The first is to aim for simplification. The second is the second is my preferred plan. You don't really need to go out of your way to simplify. If an opportunity to simplify presents itself, then you should take it. But you shouldn't necessarily give away your advantages for the sake of simplification. This is a great example. You know, what I don't like here, I don't like the idea of playing b takes a3, rook takes a3, and then trading the rooks. Like, that is unnecessary because our rook is better than white's rook. Why are you trading? Okay, so in this case, I like a move that keeps the tension. Now, what does it mean to keep the tension? Well, what do I see when I look at this? Well, what I see when I look at this is that our queen is not really playing to its fullest potential. The knight is good, the bishop is good, the rook is good, everything's doing something. The queen is a little bit kind of stuck in no man's land a little bit. And I think about, okay, well, where can the queen go? Well, you can go to b7, for example, to skewer x-ray the b2 pawn. Good. But I'm more looking at white's king. And the moment you look at white's king, as some of you are suggesting, you're spotting the move queen g5 with two ideas. Those with a keen tactical eye should notice that knight f3 check is now a threat, which white doesn't defend against. We don't need to say that twice. There's knight f3. And the second idea, by the way, was to infiltrate to d2. That wasn't the only idea. If white had gone in this position, knight e2 to g3, we would have infiltrated to d2 with our queen, forking the rook and the pawn on b2, winning the game immediately. But this ends it right away. This ends it right away. And notice how quickly we managed to win that. It was like boom, boom. Whereas if we had started to simplify in this case, and if we had taken on a3 and then done all this other stuff, the game would have been going a lot longer. Knight takes c1, obviously, we take the rook. You know, again, very important rule of converting material advantages efficiently, right? At this point, we're up a full queen. At this point, simplification is almost always justified, but still not really necessary. And yet, I liked throwing in b takes a3 just to clarify the situation on the queen side. B takes a3. Now we can grab another pawn on g2. That's a free pawn. But it's not just a free pawn. Just look at what it does to white's king side. So this is a no-brainer. You should definitely take free stuff when it presents itself. And a lot of people don't keep that straight in their mind. It's hard to explain. There's no scientific formula for when do you, at what point do I continue taking material? When do I instead go for simplification? In many cases, when you're up like a queen, there's a gazillion ways to convert, and it's largely a matter of taste. So here, we should definitely not fear the progress of the a-pawn, because the a-pawn is going absolutely nowhere. The rook on a8 is stopping the pawn. You don't even need to play rook a5. Even if the white pawn reaches a7, we're just going to pick that pawn off. So I like bishop d4. That's a great move, but we're just going to abide by our strategy of taking free stuff. Just keep taking. Take on h3. If permitted, we're going to take on d3. My guess is that white's going to go bishop c2, knowing players of this level, but we'll see. Okay, I was wrong. a5, and we can take another pawn on d3. And incidentally, it prevents a6. Funnily enough, this also prevents a6. So one good thing to do if you're, not necessarily a beginner, but if you're sort of entering intermediate level, is to always follow through with a question. When you find yourself being afraid of something, whether it's a passed pawn or some move, never just take that for granted. Always try to figure out exactly why you're afraid of this thing and whether you should be afraid of it. Queen drops back to c4, attacking the rook, pressuring the bishop, keeping contact with the knight. Yeah, queen c4 is obvious without further comments. And of course, thank you for the bishop. Hopefully white resigns here. Hopefully white resigns. Ooh, I don't know why Jeffrey's name is on the screen. That's hilarious. Yeah, it's because, sorry about that. This speedrun game is dedicated to Jeffrey, my good friend. By the way, give him a follow. And if you're watching on YouTube, twitch.tv/GMJX. He's awesome. All right. Let's quickly go over the game. All right. So c4. C4 move 2. This has been played against me. And again, it's not such a bad move if white follows it up accurately. So after knight c6, knight f3, let me just quickly follow up on a comment that I made about g6 technically not being the best move. The reason it's not the best move is because it allows white to transition the game back into open Sicilian channels. And obviously, according to theory, white is better in the Naroditsky bind. In this line, this is what's most commonly recommended by books. It's the Naroditsky bind with the pawns on c4 and e4. This position is usually reached via the open move order, knight f3, knight c6, d4 immediately, accelerated dragon, and the Naroditsky bind is defined by the move c2 to c4. As opposed to knight c3, which is the traditional accelerated dragon. And after bishop g7, bishop e3, we won't talk about this right now. We will, I'm sure, have the Naroditsky, probably even more than once. But hopefully my logic makes sense. I wouldn't mind getting this here just to demonstrate typical ideas. So that's why we didn't play in more topical fashion. If I was playing a classical game, I'd probably play the move e6. Now, the thing is, if white plays d4 here, you actually get a bad version of the Naroditsky. Here, I can get knight f6 in. Already, white's pawn center is under very serious fire. So the pawn on e4 is hanging. If knight c3, we can go bishop b4. And this is considered a pretty dubious line for white. And if white plays knight takes c6, bc, and e5, this is worth knowing. Anytime you have the pawn on e5, the king on e1 like this, you should be thinking about queen a5 check with a fork against the pawn and the king. So I don't remember what the books recommend here, but it's probably not g6. Of course, our opponent makes a serious positional error. He plays d3, and this defines our permanent domination over these key central squares. Hopefully that makes sense. Bishop g7. Let me just refresh to get brighter colors. Knight c3, d6. So as we explained, we're going bishop g4 and getting rid of the knight in order to increase and stabilize our control over particularly the d4 square. But we're not rushing with the move knight d4. This is one of the narratives of this game, is that we were patient. The control over the square is much more important than actually putting a piece on the square. You have to keep those two things separate in your mind, right? Sometimes they're basically one and the same, but a lot of time, if you have a piece controlling a square from a long distance, you don't actually need to put a piece on a square to assert your dominance over that square. e6, the Botvinnik setup. Putting the knight on e7 to not obstruct the bishop's control over that square. Isn't it bad taking on f3 if it's not forced? Not at all. Not at all. And you might say, well, I learned that you shouldn't, make two moves with one piece and trade it for a piece that's only made one move. And this is a good example of where opening principles are starting to get overtaken by concrete considerations, right? The center is completely closed. And a lot of principles and rules simply do not apply when the center is closed. I mentioned the fact of going e6 and g6. When the center is closed, virtually everything is on the table because the center is often the only way through which you can attack weaknesses. When the center is closed, you don't have to worry about anything a lot of the time. And this is a great example of that. So I think virtually every speedrun, I show you this very memorable game from early in my career where I played the moves e6 and g6, but I played them when the center was open and I got burned immediately. And I can't show this game enough. Let me show it again. I ended up winning this game, but that's totally beside the point. Super old game from 2005. So watch how quickly things go downhill. He plays the Smith-Morra. And I take, and I had no idea how to play the Smith-Morra at the time. So I was kind of ad-libbing it. I played knight c6. And at that point, I was dabbling in the dragon, so I decided it's logical to play the move g6. So he plays bishop c4. Already g6 is considered to be very dubious. So he castles. And now, of course, I had learned about the Botvinnik setup. So I decided to play e6. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go knight e7. And I'm going to go castles. And I'm just going to be totally fine. And I wasn't calculating at all. Here the center is open, which means the d file is open, which means that these dark squares, which are weakened tremendously by the move e6, are now easily exploitable by white's pieces. And he immediately pounces. No, knight e5. e5 just gives away the pawn, although that is an idea worth remembering, to push e5 to solidify your control over d6. Here, this is not necessary. Just straight away goes knight b5, threatening an unstoppable check on d6. But I decided I'm going to go knight f6. And knight d6 check is not as dangerous as it seems. I can move my king and black is still okay. But rather than knight d6, he goes suddenly queen d6. And I realize I'm busted on the spot because there's literally no way to prevent the fork on c7, which in this case is going to win the queen. So all I had left was the move queen e7, check, trade, and he wins a full rook on a8. As it turns out, things were not so simple. I grabbed a pawn on e4, and although white is completely winning, I was later able to win the knight on a8, getting compensation, and I won the game. But the sort of gist of this should be clear, that with the open center, you should be very careful about these two moves. When the center is closed, the rules of engagement are totally different because there is no engagement between the armies. So anyways, that's a pretty long-winded explanation, but hopefully you're able to understand what I'm getting at. Two completely different types of positions. So castles, we go knight g7, bishop g5, we played the move h6. And the reason we played the move, again, is because if we had castled instead, this is a worthwhile tool that you should be familiar with, even as a beginner. This battery with the idea of eliminating the fianchettoed bishop with bishop h6. For example, let's make a random move. White plays bishop h6. And of course, the point is that if you move your bishop, you give up an entire exchange. So you're virtually forced in this case to acquiesce to the trade of your main piece. Now, if you have allowed this, the traditional way that you take the sting out of bishop h6 is you preemptively move the rook. In order to be able to drop the bishop back without sacrificing the exchange. Sometimes, actually, you can sacrifice the exchange. So this would be fine, but it's a little bit awkward to allow white's bishop to sit on h6 like that. It's awkward and it's totally unnecessary when we can just throw in the move h6. And what this does is it takes the sting out of the move queen d2. And white can still play this move, but this no longer threatens anything. I could probably find an example pretty quickly of sacking an exchange. Yeah, just give me like 30 seconds. So this is an old Soviet game, Panov against Simagin. Simagin was a grandmaster. He was very strong. Panov, of course, is a person after whom the Panov attack in the Caro-Kann is named. He was an IM. So this position occurs on the board. This is a dragon Sicilian. And in the dragon, this exchange sacrifice with bishop h8 is very common, actually. So having, as a student of these ideas, you might think that Simagin would play rook e8 here, so that you can meet bishop h6 with bishop h8. But he feels that he doesn't have time for that. He needs to get stuff going on the other side of the board. So instead he goes rook c8. Okay, obviously Panov goes bishop h6, and Simagin goes bishop h8. He feels that the dark squared bishop in the dragon is more valuable than that rook on f8, and he is correct. Panov grabs it, he takes back, and it's not like black is winning on the spot or anything, but watch how quickly his decision to keep the bishop alive pays off. First, you go bishop c4. So the position is the position is very, very unclear. It's not like black is even better here, but Simagin ends up crushing him. g5, knight ft7, bishop f1 to h3 by Panov. Now Simagin plays e6 in order to lock the bishop out of the game and create kind of, again, these like bumpers that control a lot of the key central squares. Panov goes king b1. Knight centralizes to e5. And after f4, Simagin finds a crazy idea. And this idea directly justifies his decision to keep the bishop on h6 alive. Can anybody find it? I'm actually curious. This is a nutty move, and he was a very strong attacking player. This is a nutty move. And I'm not sure it's sound. Yeah, knight f3 is correct. He plays knight f3. Knight takes f3, and now bishop takes e3. Now he gives the bishop away, but for a much better cause. Of course, the point is if queen c3, you take on a2. Now, the line doesn't end here. After king a2, rook c3, bc, white has a kingdom and a horse for the queen, but it's compensated by the fact that white's king is incredibly weak and white's pieces are poorly coordinated. So, for example, I think he was probably intending the move queen c8 in order to directly harass these incredibly weak pawns, maybe prepare queen c4 check. My guess is that black is doing quite fine here without checking the engine. So, of course, he plays bc. And now d5. That queen is heading directly for a3. So Panov drops his own queen back to c1 to prevent him from coming to a3. But now the knight jumps into the attack with knight a4. It's like a classic dragon attack. ED and bishop takes a2, eliminating a key defender. King a1. He doesn't take the bishop, because if he had taken the bishop, knight c3 and queen b4, just look at the storm clouds gathering around white's king. This is just checkmate. And notice how safe black's king is. Right? Black's king is totally out of the woods. Like, it's just a one-sided attack. So instead, he tries to hide under the bishop, but the queen still comes to c5. Then the knight drops into c3. And black actually wins in pretty simple fashion. He just plays bishop takes e6. And in this position, there is this overwhelming threat of queen a5 and queen a2 with checkmate. So Panov, seeing no other defense, just gives up an entire rook to prevent that. But now he's down, well, he's technically only down, well, he's down 2 pawns, but he's also getting mated. And he loses in just a couple of moves. Gets checkmated. So maybe not the best example, but I think you get kind of the point. This is very, very common in the dragon. This exchange sacrifice with bishop h8. King's Indian also happens in the same-ish variation. So back we go to our game. Yeah, so that's about it. Bishop takes e7, of course, exacerbates the situation. Now our domination has reached just like epic magnitudes because of just the control that we have over the game. And now, after we complete our development, we focus on converting our sort of abstract positional advantage into something concrete. And of course, this plan of a6 and b5, which is so common in virtually all types of Sicilian structures, comes to the rescue here. Joji Extend says, what should white do? Well, white's... I wouldn't say that white is helpless here, but it's like borderline lost. So after a6, if I was playing white here, I would probably start by moving my queen out of the danger zone. The queen on a4 actually adds fuel to the fire because b5 comes with tempo and the queen actually gets trapped. So here probably we would have played knight d4. And again, if I were playing white, disclaimer, white's position sucks. Maybe I would try to play a4 to make it harder to play b5. Maybe I would have played the move g3 in order to create at least a decently safe escape square for the bishop. b5, bishop g2. And again, after bc, dc, rook b8, that there's pressure on the pawn. b3 runs into knight takes b3. But white can survive. Rook b1 and white holds on. Although with this knight sitting pretty on d4, it's going to be very hard. How to find b5? Well, I have no easy answer for that. You just have to know it, right? I don't think I would be able to find a6, b5. That's a little bit like asking, how do you know 9 times 7 is 63? It's almost like memorizing the multiplication tables. It's a hard plan to come up with a priori. You should just know that it exists in anti-Sicilian structures. And you're like, well, how do I know it exists? Well, you read, you listen, and you focus on acquiring a knowledge of basic ideas. But it's so common that I can literally just show you a gazillion examples of that plan being applied to the letter. Here's a game of mine from a long time ago that doesn't even start out with a Sicilian, but quickly transposes into one. And you can just see this plan in action. So this was a King's Indian attack, but it kind of transposes into a Sicilian because I decided to play e4, c5. Knight bd2, knight c6. So watch what happens. First, I do exactly what I did in the game. Rook b8, a4, bishop g4. So trade the light squared bishop because the light squared bishop is the least integral piece in black's camp. Now we drop the knight back to d7, which is, I mentioned this move in our speedrun game. It's just that we decided to put our knight on e7 to begin with. Same idea. We want the bishop to occupy the entire diagonal. And after knight d2, guess what I played? You might say, I played b5. Not yet. Don't play b5 here because that allows a takes b5. And then it gives white a really nice c4 square. Yeah, you've opened the b file, but you have now a bunch of weaknesses on the queen side. You have to be more patient than that. a6. You want to attack with the pawns. f4, b5. ab, c3. Trying to blunt the diagonal. b4. Again, using the pawns to carve and break through. And if white would have played c4 here, it would have been a very similar scenario to the game. Of course, my opponent didn't. He's strong. He tried to mix things up with e5. But in the end, I pretty easily parried all the threats, and I ended up winning the pawn. Like at the end of the day, he ended up losing this big pawn on c3, and I won the game in the end. So I can show you 1,000 examples of this b5 plan, but for now, suffice it to say that this should be the first thing you enter into your database of ideas if you want to play the Sicilian properly. Okay, let's go back to speedrun game one more time. And once that plan is set in motion, white is in huge trouble. h3, knight d4. Again, I would play queen d1 here. I think this might be the last chance. After bishop d1, b5, yeah, the game is over. Because if white would have played queen a5, first of all, if queen a3, then of course b4 traps, forks the queen and the knight. So queen a5 was the last hope. And here, I think the simplest is just to play rook f to b8. First, we defend the b6 square, right? If you play knight c6 immediately, then white plays queen b6. So anytime you have a situation like this, right, where the queen basically has only one escape square, you should start by asking yourself, well, do I actually need to rush? Do I need to make a move that carries a direct threat? Or can I make a second-order threat? A second-order threat is a move that threatens a threat, right? Rook f8 itself is not a threat. Knight c6 is the actual threat, but rook f8 sets it up, and knight c6 is going to win the game. And white can do nothing about knight c6. Nothing about knight c6. Okay, I guess there's the move knight e2 to open up a pathway for white's queen. Who can tell me what black should do against knight e2? And this is all about being flexible, right? Yeah, knight c6 was the idea just now, but you're asking yourself, okay, but what else can I do in this position? Thank you, the silky go. Not b4. I knew some people would fall for this move. It's tempting. But after queen a4, the queen is surprisingly safe, right? What are you going to attack the queen with? Instead, you actually play it even simpler. bc. The b2 pawn is hanging, and white loses it. And with that b2 pawn, goes white's entire queenside. The position just... White can resign here. I mean, just look at this. Takes. You're attacking f2. Your bishop is now a monster. White can't even play rook e2 because now you take, and the rook anyone hangs. White can't play bishop e2 because, again, if rook takes e2. So it is just totally lost. Totally lost. So there was nothing that white could do after b5. Of course, after the trade, the queen is literally trapped. We win the queen. We push b4. We activate our queen. Right? We just identify which piece isn't playing to its fullest potential. And, of course, the idea was to infiltrate the d2 square. After knight f3, the rest is obvious without comments. We just ended up taking all of white's pawns. And that's all she wrote, folks. So this actually ended up being a pretty extensive analysis, which means I probably will put this out as its own YouTube video. This was instructive. I think this was our first, like, top to bottom instructive game that wasn't decided by an opening blunder. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the examples. And again, our emphasis is on openings and on building your knowledge of opening ideas. So it's entirely acceptable to not play the openings I recommend in the speedrun. I still hope you'll find the games instructive, but I'm doing this with an aim toward helping relative beginners basically start their acquisition of opening repertoire from scratch. So the funny thing is the one thing I haven't fully decided is whether I'm recommending Smith Mora or Alep and Sicilian. I think since the openings are so similar to each other, I might alternate them. Where can we find Accelerated Dragon Theory? Well, there are books on the Accelerated Dragon. I don't actually have any of them. I know they exist. But again, this is not going to be a satisfying question, but I hope that through the course of the speedrun, that's my vision. My vision is that you, like, by watching all of the games, you will actually be able to construct a full repertoire for yourself. We will eventually get games where our opponents go into the main lines, and that's where we will discuss theory. And eventually I might put some of the theory into Lichess studies. I haven't decided yet, but let's not jump the gun just yet. How should black deal with the Naroditsky bind? Okay, so again, please understand the order here. We will face the Naroditsky bind eventually. When we do, I will talk about it very extensively. And actually, my recommendation against the Naroditsky is going to be not bishop g7, but straight away to play the move knight f6, attacking e4. A lot of people here already are going to play takes on e5. This is like the first trap, but that's not the reason I'm recommending this line. Here you have queen a5 check. The point of knight f6 is after knight c3, you take on d4, and then you play d6. This is a very underrated line in my opinion, and this is a very dangerous line for white. The point is simple. You're luring the queen to d4 so that after bishop g7, there is a pin going on, and you're trying to force white to lose more tempi, moving the queen back from d4. And this is a very dynamic line. Tons of players with white end up misplaying this super quickly. We will get this, I'm sure, probably sooner rather than later. But anyways, let's put that aside for now. Thanks for hanging out today, and I'll see you all tomorrow.